Thank you, Monique. Welcome everyone to the Utah Historical Society's November lecture for our Perspective series. We have Dr. Branden Little here today with us. Dr. Little is a professor of history at Weber State University, where he researches the international history of the United States, humanitarian relief, and expeditionary warfare. He specializes in the era of the First and Second World Wars. He earned a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in National Security Affairs from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and his BA in International Relations and History from the University of California, Davis. He's received prizes for his doctoral dissertation and master's thesis, and we're just very grateful to have you, Dr. Little. So please take it away. The time is yours.
Brandy and Monique for having me today, and thank you for logging in today and joining me in a brief conversation about Utah and the world at war, as I sometimes like to call it. And in many respects, I imagine some of you already have a sense of this conflict, but I thought I'd do a little bit of kind of surveying areas of the war that are familiar and undoubtedly some that are less familiar, and also to talk about some of the ways in which the state of Utah has undertaken to commemorate the war. And so just by way of navigating the images here, of course, the image of soldiers kind of running through and then scaling up a trench, going over the top is one of these iconic types of images that we most commonly associate with the First World War. In many ways, our imagination, especially an American imagination of this conflict that originated more than a century ago, is very much anchored in the trench lines of what we call the Western Front and conflict between Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, and the United States. I would be remiss to say that this was not a global war in which war raged in Africa. It was fought in China. There were battles in the Pacific Ocean. There was a battle off the coast of Uruguay. There were battles in a host of places around the world. The modern Middle East, as a region, also was enveloped by conflict too. And so this was a global catastrophe in which Utah had had a role. And to see just the image on the right, this very vivid political cartoon depicting a militarized Uncle Sam. He's not wearing his candy cane striped pants this time. He's donned his khakis and put on his American soldier's uniform, pointing a pistol ultimately at the German emperor, who's got a whip depicting all his cruelties, and you can kind of see that cross. So Uncle Ham, wow, Uncle Sam is, if anything, in some ways a patron protector of this damsel in distress, and this notion of war-wearied populations needing rescued is part of the American imagination in the First World War. And from the very, very beginning days of the war in 1914, Americans very quickly came to understand that this was a war in which peoples needed saving. And even peoples with whom Americans had relatively little contact, such as the Belgians. And by contact, I mean through immigration chiefly. There have been lots of German immigrants to places such as Utah. Even the governor at the time was a German immigrant. And there were actually quite a few Ukrainians who had hailed from the Russian Empire, born in places such as Odessa and Kiev at this time, too. And so Utah, of course, was a cosmopolitan place with a host of peoples from Europe, and frankly around the world by the time of the First World War. But there you see Uncle Sam. And just below it, for good measure and good fun, there's a photo opportunity of Belgian children who are celebrating their receipt of the delivery of bread by the United States government. And actually, not by the government. Well, I apologize, but not by quite the government, but they are acknowledging sort of American protection vis-a-vis a private organization called the Commission for Relief in Belgium. And so we'll discuss a few of these things along the way. And I certainly hope we have plenty of time for questions as we close. Uh, by way of navigating, one of my paramount objectives is not just to say, teach you a few new things, but to empower you to learn on your own. And the past decade and beyond have been witnessed tremendous explosions in literature on the First World War. And in Utah specifically, there have been a number of collections and contributions that you might be interested in pursuing, many of which are available freely online. Who could fault that? To highlight one particular novel contribution, which I assigned in my honors seminar at Weber State on the First World War, to help cement for students this idea of the local is global. So often we think of, say, local history stories as disconnected from perhaps international ones. But Alan Kent Powell's Utah and the Great War is a tremendous collection that features primarily articles from the Utah Historical Quarterly over decades that studied aspects of the First World War, ranging from Native American participation in the state of Utah in responses to the conflict, the LDS Church, and a host of differing types of societal dynamics within Utah during and even in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. And so, if you're looking for a book that sort of is more recent scholarship collected in one single volume, handsomely edited by one of the foremost historians in the state of Utah, a longtime state historian, Kent Powell, I couldn't recommend Utah and the Great War enough. It's tremendously useful. Recently, also, the Utah Historical Quarterly published a retrospective series of essays, which you can find online also, called Remembering the Great War. And I have an image there of the cover with the memorial statue hand raised. Sometime before this, and is an inestimably valuable contribution by an individual named Noble Warham, titled Utah in the World War. And I've got the spine there. You can see the brown cover as well as the cover page there. I believe something in the realm of maybe 1,200 copies or so were printed. And there you can see number 764. This was the state of Wisconsin's honorary copy. It's always curious as to which editions get digitized and elevated to the fore of our awareness. If you're interested in looking at examining actual copies, there are several in the collection at the Fort Douglas Military History Museum, and I suspect at the U and Weber State and other universities as well. So I know that Amazon even has a copy for sale too. But if you're interested in reading a very, very, very detailed history written in 1924. So just shortly after the war had concluded, it's an extraordinarily rich volume, and it pairs quite well with these other sources. A few years ago, I wrote an essay based on a speech, actually, that I was invited to give and honored to give at the state capitol on the occasion of the anniversary of the end of World War I in November of 2018. Governor Herbert was there, and it was quite an event. And I was asked to think of and give some remarks about the conclusion of the war. And fundamentally, the subtitle, An Improbable Peace, suggested my thesis, which outlined the ideas that the end of the war, and not just the end of the war, but its absolute destructiveness across a variety of of arenas in the field of societies and in the field of diseases and in politics and economics. It was such an all-consuming conflict. It was unlikely that simply the abrupt end, or what seemed like a fairly abrupt ending to a war, would somehow produce peace. And so I examined elements of this in that talk, and that was reprinted in another issue of the Utah Historical Quarterly, and that's available online also. If you're interested in examining or doing it, just dabbling a little bit, we know that Wikipedia catches people's attention regularly. Another source I would recommend is titled 1914-18 online, and there in the middle on the left of this screen, you can see a slide or a little header that says International Encyclopedia of the First World War. This was an international collaborative project consisting of several hundred historians, including myself, who wrote essays on a variety of aspects of the conflict over the past 10 years. And people contribute still today, but it's the most recent and authoritative and, dare I say, semi-comprehensive. I say semi because nothing could ever purport to be truly comprehensive. But it's an extraordinary resource, and many people just don't know of it. And so if you're interested in, Serbia or medical societies and aid societies or a host of topics, International Encyclopedia of 1914-18 is a tremendously good and freely available resource. Just below is another compendium, lavishly illustrated they're published by Oxford University Press, and the author is a distinguished uh, scholar in the British Isles named Hugh Strachan. And his illustrated history of the First World War is a superb collection with detailed essays ranging from women, or essays on women to essays on the air war, essays on war at sea. And so there are sort of thematically oriented essays that could repay reading. One of my colleagues up north at Utah State, named Tammy Proctor, she's written many things, but one of them is titled Civilians in a World at War, and it is a very rich overview and examination of aspects of what we could often call the home front, and considering the ways in which people who weren't soldiers were engulfed by the war too. One of my former students, who was also a key member of the commemorative exercises, commemorative processes undertaken by the state of Utah in 2017-2018, Valerie Jacobson, composed some curriculum. It's about 50 pages, but mostly it's documents and letters of a particular Utah soldier. It's very well written, and it's a good primer, in effect, a good short, well edited and composed sort of immersion into Utah's experience. And so, if Warham's book is a little too daunting, and Powell's perhaps, Valerie's is a superb way to begin. And then, likewise, if you're interested in traveling the state and examining where World War I memorials and monuments are, believe it or not, they're everywhere in the state of Utah. This pamphlet, which is also available online, is lavishly illustrated. It has a nice map in the back as well, and descriptions of how different counties decided to construct and for what reasons various monuments. And it's a superb collection, and I was delighted to participate in parts of its publication. Which speaks to a couple of themes here about why say were there efforts to create some curriculum for social studies teachers especially, and then a monuments book. Why was there an event at the state capitol? Actually, there were two in 2017 and in 2018, but collectively, these events all were spearheaded by tremendous group, or terrific group of people. Um, at the time, Representative Steve Handy in the Assembly had the novel idea to seek an appropriation to commemorate the war. And so, with that money, we kind of assembled a team of historians and members of the historical community writ large, and undertook to uh, commemorate or re-commemorate, say, a Doughboy Monument statue of a soldier and get its restoration up in Ogden Cemetery, to have events at a host of public places, to spearhead and student research, and also to try and elevate public awareness of this seismic conflict that very likely affected people, but they might not realize how it did. And so the Utah World War I Commission was the state body that was authorized and empowered to basically orchestrate these events and figure out how best to manage the state's processes to elevate awareness. Many other states in the United States undertook similar activities, and there was a National World War I Commission as well. And collectively, there were quite a few events in 2017, 2018 across the United States, and Utah was a vibrant part of these. And so let's shift over to discussing a little bit about what I would characterize as, in the earliest phases of the war, as active neutrality. Oftentimes, you may hear the term neutrality associated with the first 3 years of America's wartime experiences, and that's fair. But sometimes we think of neutrality as perhaps passive, and the United States was deeply engaged in the war from the very beginning. And I've provided some text here, and you can review it at your leisure. But one of the ways in which we've come to deepen our understanding of American responses to the conflict that originates in 1914 is by considering the responses of the immigrant population in the United States. Estimates are that 40% of the American people had at least one parent born overseas in 1914. 40%. And tens of millions had recently emigrated themselves from the 1880s, 1890s, and thereafter. And so, in many respects, at the cusp of the war's beginning, the United States was so much more deeply a genuinely immigrant nation than we might have otherwise thought of it. However, many historians and even some contemporary officials in the White House and in various ambassadors and so forth tended to discount the serious and deep connections that Americans retained to their loved ones in Europe. You could only imagine over the past few weeks or so, with a natural disaster, say the hurricane in, say, North Carolina or Florida, or choose your least favorite disaster du jour, that if you had loved ones who lived there, you could, nobody would think it odd that you were deeply and passionately concerned about their well-being. Maybe you've raised money. Maybe you assist them in various ways, shapes, and forms. Well, the same is true about American responses in 1914. There was a tremendous outpouring of money, of efforts to raise money, or not just money, but food, to send supplies. And often these were anticipatory responses where people thought, well, people probably need bandages. People probably need food. People probably need clothes. And so they're, even in the absence of requests for help, Americans were exceedingly generous in dispatching ships filled with a host of humanitarian materials for Europe at the very, very beginning of the war. Soon, those kind of spontaneous responses were organized in various ways. You might think the American Red Cross would be a key leader in these initiatives, but it really wasn't, because it was far less well structured and poised for immediate responses than it would become by 1917, 1918. So the first couple of years of the war, it was you could say a Wild West-like scenario for humanitarians or would-be humanitarians. And one of the foremost individuals that would lead the way, who kind of came out of the woodwork in American awareness, was a fellow named Herbert Hoover. You've probably heard the name. He becomes the president, often reviled for his associations with the Great Depression. But his electability in that landslide election in 1928 came directly as a result of American confidence in his administrative abilities, his humanitarian statesmanship, and his ability to organize the nation-feeding responses, or the efforts to feed the nation of Belgium, uh, and a slice of northern France that resided under German occupation. Hoover managed the daily feeding of 9.6 million people for the duration of the war and for months thereafter. It was an extraordinary achievement, and Americans delighted in their prestige, and they relished the idea that they were rescuing peoples from harm, rescuing innocents, preventing the cataclysm from claiming needless casualties or even more than peoples had ever imagined. And so ships like the one above on that slide that say California, Commission for Relief in Belgium, well, states across the United States, not Utah, but many states like Kansas and others organize specific ships that they, if a particular state raised enough food, they could fill a ship and then claim it was theirs. And so there was sort of this stakeholder patron relationship that Americans felt. But Utahns contributed to Belgian relief, as well as many, many other humanitarian causes, which were endless. Um, but one of the things that we often don't associate with the period of neutrality, in which the United States avowed that it wouldn't fight in the war, was one of the core reasons why the Woodrow Wilson administration, President Wilson, elected not to enter the war in any particular way. His hesitancy emanated in part because of his awareness of that immigrant population. He was a child of the American Civil War, and he did not want the American people to fight at home over their divided opinions about which one of the two warring coalitions should prevail. He didn't want French and English peoples slugging it out with German Americans or Austrians on the streets of San Francisco, for example. And so, in one sense, the message that the Wilson administration conveyed was, as a neutral government, the United States would function basically as a sanctuary. He hoped that it would be free of violence. It wasn't. German agents conducted sabotage, much like allegedly Russian agents might be doing against DHL planes, delivery planes in Europe, bound for the United States, if you caught that headline over the past few weeks in European news. At least it seems to me that there's a similarity there. But Wilson was worried about civil war in the United States. In other words, Europeans and European immigrants hadn't severed their ties when they came here. Nobody expected that they should or would. Meanwhile, Americans were more worried in many ways in 1915, 1916 about the possibility of war, not in Europe, but with Mexico. Throughout, from 1911 onward, year after year, there was continuing tension emanating from the violence that engulfed parts of revolutionary Mexico. And American business people, travelers, tourists, sailors, and others were implicated and sometimes hurt by this violence. The United States often demanded Americans be shielded and protected, but increasingly the Wilson administration was agitated and ultimately threatened to invade to stabilize the situation. And so the third or fourth bullet point here on the slide is in connection with the photograph in the bottom right of the slide, speaks to the fact that the Wilson administration ordered the mobilization of all National Guard units across the country. In Utah, that preparation was an opportunity to actually discover what equipment shortages there were and to check their inventories and to really do the grunt work, so to speak, of figuring out how to pack your pack and get ready to move. This was an exceedingly useful preliminary for deployment overseas to Europe. But nobody expected at that moment that the Guard units would be deployed overseas. But as they amassed and organized and equipped and moved down to the southern border of the United States with Mexico, the Utah Guard discovered that this process of mobilization was exceedingly valuable and a good rehearsal for a much bigger one overseas. Some of those Utah troops ended up being sent once that initial crisis had abated sufficiently. Some of them were sent to California for additional training, and then subsequently to Europe. But one of the fascinating elements of Utah's World War I participation that Kent Powell, the state historian, has argued is that by achieving a good reputation in its mobilization, Utah soldiers demonstrated that they were professional. They were also uncommonly sober, as you can only imagine. And when I say sober, what's striking about it is our U.S. Army officials didn't really expect much by way of sobriety among new inductees, new draftees, new recruits, basically. And soldiers back in this era were often considered riffraff. Sailors were too. In the U.S. Navy, oftentimes in this era, you would not wish a U.S. sailor to be your neighbor. They were considered to be patrons of brothels and dens of iniquity that would spread vice and disease. So the notion of valorous, distinguished troops as virtuous citizens was one thing that Utah contributed to the beginning phases of mobilization for the war, when ultimately the United States would pursue a declaration of war against Germany and then in Austria in 1917. And so Kent Powell argues that this process of Utah elevating its reputation as an essential part of the nation led toward its Americanization. And by that he meant, and I completely agree with him, that for Utahns, their reputation with the national government, certainly the federal government, and in American society as a whole, there's this heritage of this exodus to the Salt Lake Basin under duress. Was one of varying antagonism with federal authorities and the U.S. Army and so forth. And I'm sure many of you know the story better than I. But World War I provided an opportunity for Utah to demonstrate its loyalty to the nation, to become integrated and assimilated into the fabric of the nation in a completely new way. And that is part of a broader process during the war as it thrust peoples from all around the country into, say, Army units. Of course, National Guard units kind of retained their cohesiveness from states, but there were also volunteers from Utah who joined the regular Army, and it's a real mishmash of peoples. But as a whole, the United States Army and Navy and Marine Corps were institutions that helped to bring peoples together who might not have otherwise met. And Utahns represented themselves very well in this conflict. Of course, the United States pivoted to war in 1917, but I put belligerency here, meaning war pursuits, in 1918, because frankly, there were really no combat forces engaged in fighting, or no American combat forces engaged in fighting, really until the summer and fall of 1918. You might think that that's odd, but that it took over a year fundamentally to get Americans in the field of battle. But there was this crash course of war mobilization across the country in 1917. There had been very little mobilization efforts undertaken, in part because of presidential policies that prevented them. Largely, President Wilson had felt that efforts to get the nation ready for war were unneutral, and as a result, he hindered war planning and other initiatives. But once the nation did join the war as a military member and joined the British and the French and the Belgians and Italians for a time, the coalition changes a little here and there. But as a whole, the United States got most of its troops overseas by way of sheer number in the summer and fall of 1918. And it took time to train them. The British and the French did most of the training of American soldiers in France. And American troops there also went over in greater number because they didn't bring much equipment with them. Many of us are probably familiar with the lore of an Ogden native named John Moses Browning, who is an icon of firearms invention. But most of Browning's inventions didn't accompany the soldiers in quite the number that we might think. Instead, most Americans discover that they're being armed with a variety of British and French weaponry. In one sense, the British and the French militaries were the arsenals of democracy, if you want to call them that. But in addition to, of course, guns, there's butter. And Utahns were engaged in such as things as beet production, as you see in the bottom, all ages, in an age when everybody was called to duty. And thinking and reflecting about Veterans Day, which we just had this week, one of the things that Americans understood in the World Wars in ways that they really haven't since is that they were all deputized. In one sense, they were all conscripted into a common war purpose. And I'm not quite sure why. And lots of scholars examine these types of questions, but I'm not sure why American leaders have never undertaken to mobilize the American people in quite the same way for, say, wars in Vietnam or Afghanistan or anywhere else, frankly. But in this conflict, the First World War, everybody from all ages was called to act. Um, and the numbers, one of the interesting things about the numbers here, which I find, which I want to share with you, which is kind of insider information, if you will, is that the World War I Commission for the state of Utah, as we were working on trying to update the data and the research for the Utah's participation in the war, we did our utmost to collect various lists of casualties and also numbers that had served during the war. And believe it or not, it was an impossible task. We have approximate data, but there are no absolutely precise numbers about the number of Utahns that served in the war, as well as those that died or were wounded during the conflict. We have pretty good numbers, but I wouldn't say that they are precise. It was not for want of trying. And I'll indicate some of the reasons why there's a little ambiguity. One of the complexities is, how does one define a Utahn? Is it somebody who was born in the state of Utah? But what if you were living in Massachusetts and had lived there for most of your life, and you joined the Massachusetts National Guard and went to France? Are you a Utahn in the armed forces? Or is the definition of simply peoples in Utah who joined the military during the years 1917, 1918? And so then the definitions are part of the challenge of establishing precision. Women were also a part, and Maud Fitch is the taller woman on the left of this image, walking on the streets of Paris. But there were some Utah women who did deploy overseas in various capacities, but more women were certainly involved on the home front in the state. The numbers of the dead are also problematic and complicated. As you might imagine, Some soldiers died from disease, such as the influenza pandemic, often called incorrectly, but often called the Spanish flu. Some died uh, from immediately from shell fire, such as artillery or bullets or things of that nature, and others died subsequent to their injuries. And so the notion of war dead is more elastic. Um, Moreover, when do we define war death as having concluded? This is a question of enduring importance for such conflicts as the Vietnam War, where family members have sometimes argued that service members who served in Vietnam, who might have died a year or two after the war, or maybe a decade or longer, due to causes that they associate with the war, either medically or perhaps suicide associated with war traumas. Um, are they a casualty of the war then? And do they deserve a name on the say the Vietnam Memorial? And this is a these types of questions of where do you draw the lines is an intriguing one, but a real challenging one for scholars. I want to emphasize, though, that just because the war comes to an end didn't mean that the injured didn't continue to die. And if you look at closely at Utah newspapers, such as Utah Standard Examiner, after or Salt Lake Tribune also. Right as after the war into December and so forth, even a month after, there are articles about Utahns who had died in French hospitals. And so family, could you imagine though, for a family member who had might not have even known of their loved one being injured, hearing of the war having concluded, and only to find out that they were wounded and then died after the war. However, we have some tentative data, the injured that's anecdotal, but nevertheless, we have some data, some stories of some Utahns who had suffered, say, poison gas injuries and such, the chemical weapons that had burnt their lungs, and they died sooner than their age group would have suggested. In other words, you would have probably been expected to live into your 70s or beyond, and instead maybe you die in your 30s. And the family members understood that individual was perpetually sick or more sickly, pneumonia and other lung ailments as a result of their war service. And so this notion of when does war end is a fascinating one that I work on extensively. Um, Ultimately, I'd like to at least pose one additional question, and that would be, did the Allied victory actually produce peace? To come back to that idea of the beginning and the end of war, and we often acknowledge on November 11th. Initially, it was called Armistice Day, and now we've got Veterans Day. We've kind of forgotten the connection to the First World War, and it's the notion of why that date was so important. Interestingly enough, the slogan, especially in the British Empire, for the past century, has been "Lest we not forget," and it's repeated at many war ceremonies, commemorations, time and again, every November 11th around the world. But one of the things that I find insufficient about that phrase is it doesn't tell us what we should remember. It says we shouldn't forget, but what is it that we should remember? I wish for you to remember that as the war ended officially and the combat really stopped, it didn't mean that people weren't hurt, people weren't angry, and in some places these resentments would fuel hatreds such as those of Adolf Hitler's, rage, Mussolini's, antagonisms, rages and psychoses in people like Joseph Stalin, who was also a World War I veteran, along with Hitler and Mussolini. And we know that they would undertake campaigns of tremendous brutality and horror that would engulf much of the world in the 1930s and 40s. Moreover, civil wars in a host of places, and I've listed a few here, including Ireland and Germany and Russia, soon exploded. So just because the major coalitions of enemies, such as Germany fighting Britain and France and America, for example, just because those wars ended didn't mean internal wars didn't explode. And those continued in some cases for years and years and years. Moreover, from a public health perspective, famine and disease, hunger, malnourishment had a telling tale. Tens of millions of people died as a direct result of the First World War on account of famine and disease. 4 million in Persia or in modern day Iran, 5 million in the Soviet or what Russia, and those are just large numbers to give you an example. The estimates are that 1/4 of the state population of Utah contracted in 1918-19 the influenza pandemic or influenza from this global pandemic. Utahns at the time, moreover, masked up, some of them, and some communities responded differently. For good fun, up in Ogden, where the rail junction is, city officials debated whether they should have a parade or not to welcome home the troops, despite concerns that large groups of people gathered together might be a vector of communicable disease. And unsurprisingly, shortly after the Welcome Home the Troops parade, the local hospitals filled with influenza patients. And some of those articles about influenza, I believe, are in Kent Powell's Utah in the War book. By way of survivors, one of the individuals I'm sure many of you have heard of is Ernest Hemingway. I was an ambulance driver. I went to the Ernest Hemingway Museum in Bassano del Grappa, Italy, just out of Venice this spring, and participated in a conference there, and spoke about Hemingway as an individual whose entire body of work, all of his literature, uh, Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, et cetera, et cetera. There's a tremendous short stories also that are enveloped by conversations about the war. And seems to me, and some others who are far better Hemingway scholars than I am, that he never escapes the war. And I imagine some of you understand well and know firsthand people in your own lives whose war service never left them. In other words, they didn't come back from Vietnam or Afghanistan. I want to highlight one particular individual, and I'm about to close up here, so we have some questions. But in this kind of portraiture in the middle here is a fellow named James Wesley Chipman. He's a Utahn. And I knew his niece, who passed away recently, but she was married to a colleague of mine, Richard Sadler, at Weber State for the longest time. And Sadler is also a Utah historian. But Chipman was an LDS missionary in Manchester, England, when the war erupted, and remained there for about the first year and a half of the conflict. And the impression that we get from his diary and service there was that the war scared him, horrified him. And when the draft or when opportunities to volunteer came up, Chipman didn't volunteer. He didn't want to go back. But when he was drafted, he did. And Chipman didn't survive the war. And another one of my other students at Weber State's nephews was a fellow named George Gidney, for whom the VFW post up in Brigham City is named after George Gidney. Guess what? Newspapers like the Ogden Standard here celebrated and declared peace associated with this end of war in November 1918. But the families got telegrams that said, your loved ones just died, including the Gidney family on the very day of those newspapers on November 11th. What is there to celebrate? I submit to you that the families in Utah that had loved ones overseas did not necessarily celebrate the end of the war in quite the way we might think of parades and just genuine happiness, because they were deeply worried about the survival of their loved ones, whether they would come home, whether they would come home intact or not, and what harms that they would have as a result. And so I've already mentioned kind of how the state capitol and the state of Utah it took a tremendous effort to acknowledge the war, and I think what we're doing today is an echo of that. And I'm happy to entertain whatever questions you have for me. So, thank you.
You, Dr. Little, for that. That was a really interesting presentation. Monique put in the chat that we welcome any questions. Feel free to put them there in the chat or in the Q&A section of the webinar. And to just kick it off, I have a few questions to get us started. There's so many interesting things to talk about, and you peppered your slides with some really great illustrations and artwork. And so what were some of those iconic images that Utahns may have seen either during or after the war?
Great question. Thanks, Brandy. Thinking of some of the images, one of the ways that we often think about images, and certainly Utahns were uh, aware of them, were what we often call these propaganda posters, these lavishly illustrated ones. And in fact, I'll back up here a little bit, and then we see the kind of this "Remember Belgium" one on the side here, and there were various government entities during the war, bureaus, administrations, commissioned artwork, and sometimes illustrators, and these were the most distinguished illustrators in the United States, who who often wrote into these government agencies and said, I want to contribute. I feel the need as a patriot to contribute. And so there's this dialogue there between the government, which is trying to kind of steer and fashion a vision of what is the war about. And I'm fascinated by this interplay between war artistry and kind of like government, you could say kind of the efforts of the government. Many historians try to emphasize that the government kind of tries to whip the people up into a frenzy and kind of to indoctrinate them and brainwash them into a particular vision of war. And all the governments during World War I do it. However, in World War I, what I'm finding in researching posters specifically, by looking at the artists, is that the artists were much more engaged in a participatory dialogue. What I find, in some ways, they're preaching to the choir, so to speak. They're creating images that are commonly understood kind of frames of reference in an age when action photography didn't exist, in which there very little motion picture cinema, and as a result, action illustration was one of the most dynamic ways that you could capture an image. And so a lot of the war artistry in these kinds of posters, like Remember Belgium for a Liberty, basically to fundraise for the war, these are the kinds of posters that most Utahns would be seeing plastered all over the place. And as well as in their magazines and newspapers, a variety of black and white pictures, photographs like the ones you can see here, as well as lots and lots of illustrations. And sometimes people say that the illustration might not be factual, but the picture would be. But sometimes what if you really look and consider the dynamics of what the illustrator was doing, kind of like a combat illustrator, they could capture elements that no photographer in that era could. So it's possible and very likely that often the illustrations were more truthful in capturing the essence of what was occurring than anybody else could create with the technologies of the day.
Wow. I love that. So that is part of your current work then, is
Yeah,
looking
it
at these
is. It is. It's a
illustrators.
side project, but I love it. Yeah. I like to draw, so
Wonderful.
that's part of the reason why.
Oh, so great. Well, we did have a question pop in the Q&A. Um, they they learned so much, wonderful presentation, and saying yesterday we had a conversation about how schools in Utah don't have the day off for Veterans Day. Do you have any insights on why that is, and what are key points you'd like K through 12 Utah students to know about World War One?
I teaching in a Utah university, I wonder the same question myself. Utah or Weber State does have a Veterans Day appreciation dinner, but that's different. That's not the same thing as a for federal employees, such as Hill Air Force Base. They get the day off. I'm not quite sure why that is, but in term, I'm sure there's a reason, and that could probably be traced. But in terms of K through 12, that document or kind of that it's like a 50-page brochure that Valerie Jacobson produced. I think is an excellent resource for teachers to sort of get familiarized with not only just the brief background of the war, but also to have some documents available, say letters from a soldier home that they could have students read and think about and engage in conversations. And there's nothing quite like immersing yourself into the artifacts of yesteryear of any period, but seeing those original materials or even copies of them, of course, in this case, but having students work with letters and from people and seeing photographs of real people, sometimes from their own communities, helps to forge these connections that are deep. Sometimes they might realize, hey, that's my relative, and those are really special moments too. But Valerie's, I'd say I would recommend Valerie's work.
Great. Thank you. And that is on our Utah Historical Society website. And if anyone needs any help finding that, just send one of us an email and we can get you there.
Wonderful.
Um, we have another question that I think is really interesting, and it goes to the claim that you said from Kent Powell about this Americanization of Utah. Was World War One, 1918, is this a turning point in how the rest of the country is really beginning to view Utah and Utah's loyalty to the US?
Was the war a turning point in this American appreciation for Utah? Yes, and I defer to Powell in this regard because he knows Utah best. But I think one of the intriguing elements of this is, of course, this is also in the same era as individuals like Senator Reed Smoot, who kind of rises in national prominence, and conversations about you could say Utah's participation in national civic dialogues and governance, and seeing that fundamentally the concerns of this state or these people are no different than the rest of the nation. It is part of that way in which Americans start to appreciate this. Uh, you could say Americanness of Utah. And part of the interesting thing is also with the actual soldiers is to see the ways in which the War Department or officials in the War Department are the ones who first start to recognize the value of sobriety, which they attribute to a particular faith tradition, and in one sense, that an unanticipated and wholly welcome benefit was soldiers who could actually show up to duty who weren't incapacitated by drunkenness. See, and you could only imagine in the chaos of where are the troops and how do you get everybody together at the same place in the same time and wear a uniform and all those things that having some people show up and follow orders and not cause problems would be so attractive to senior officials in Washington. And and as for how much awareness the rest of the nation had of Utah's actual participation, I'm not sure. But I know from a national government perspective in Washington, they start to look at Utah as, if you will, maybe a favored son.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
We also Wendy, our K through 12 initiatives director, has provided the link to the primary source set. So it's in the chat now for everyone to find. Um, I think I mean, we're almost here at the end, and because public history is so dear to me, could you speak or provide some closing remarks on your comment, the local is global, and why it is so important for us to look at these local stories today?
I think that there invariably there are, say, some children or people in a community who are just intrigued by the foreign, if you will, or the international stories. There's something about it that mesmerizes them. Fair enough. But there's a lot of people that don't find that resonate to them. Maybe words like relevant and other things, they just don't find it connect to them. Oh, that's not relevant to me in my life. Or, but one of the ways that this field of public history, or this idea of engaging people through the lens of history, that we can pursue to witness to them and to reach them, is by forging those intimate, personal, local connections, things that matter to them, and to identify their relationships with sometimes these titanic events of yesteryear. And by tracing some of these stories, say that here's a member of, say, that went to your high school, is buried in the cemetery across the street, is part of the fabric of your community. Um, or that sometimes can induce this awareness. Other times, I think it's, and by seeing some of the ways that prior generations did responded similarly, like the influenza pandemic, is certainly a rich topic for comparison. I find that having students read those articles, or anybody read those articles about how you it in they I don't even have to draw connections. They make their own. And often they're deeply personal ones, like, oh, I remember when my school closed, or I remember this, right? And they soon see that they're part of a continuum of historical events, but that the peoples maybe a century ago are really not that far from them. And I think that idea of reducing distance, whether it be geographic, such as thousands of miles away, or chronological, by it's a century ago or so, is one way to really forge this idea of, actually, we're all in this together, and we have a lot to learn, and we should be compassionate as we do.
I love it. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Hmm.
Well, everyone, we are basically at time. So I'd just like to thank you for coming and thank you
Thank you.
again, Dr. Little, for being here. And we will work on getting this uploaded to our YouTube channel so that others can watch it and share it. And again, thank you, everyone.